I'll get us started. And I'm Emily Weiler with the Montana Public Health Training Center. I'm really excited for this series of trainings. I have worked with Annie Belcourt on a variety of projects over many, many years. And excitingly, actually have a lot of experience working with her on digital storytelling back when I was a field researcher doing air quality work across Western Montana and some other areas in the US. So we go way back and I like having that connection to this topic. So I'm excited to be here. I'll be here, of course, the whole time today. So if you have any technical issues, let me know. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So we'll make sure that no questions to Annie get missed. If you get booted for any reason, no worries. Click that Zoom link and I will let you back in. And as I mentioned, we are recording today. So I will send that out as a resource as soon as possible after today. And you can then review it, or like I said, for anyone, especially if you know folks that couldn't make it today, we'll make sure they have it before next week's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Annie and you can get us going.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled really to be here, and I'll be with you the next three Wednesdays, so including today. So let's dive in a little bit. I know if you, Stacy or others who are on the call too, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we'd love to hear about your work and just a little bit about your interest area. Feel free to pop that into the chat and everybody can take a look. You know, one of the things that we think about in public health, and to tell you about myself, I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I actually graduated from the University of Montana back in 2006 and had completed some postdoctoral work in the University of Colorado, Denver. And so some of what I'll be telling you about today is really looking at engaging diverse populations, and oftentimes what we think of as underserved populations here in Montana. But really widely, a lot of the things that we'll discuss can really apply to any population as we think about community engagement, as we think about ways to expand public health, and as we think about prevention and intervention. And we'll look at some examples of videos that have been used in both research setting as well as more advocacy oriented public health settings. So that'll be a fun aspect. Today, we're going to kind of provide some of the background and a little bit of just some examples of what we're talking about in terms of the diversity of digital storytelling. Back when I first started as a public health faculty, I started to be, this was in 2010, interested in how we could expand access points. So that's been one area of passion for me is how do we find ways to engage communities that are not often represented or not often included in discussions around public health. And when we know in Montana, we have a lot of disparities in health in different ways. And a lot of our diverse communities are those that are shouldering a lot of the public health burden, you know, with regard to you know, disease or different sorts of mental health kind of issues, as well as substance abuse and houselessness, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that background today, but also how we start to move the dialogue towards things that are resiliency based. And I wrote my dissertation on resiliency within American Indian communities. And some of the things that I learned from that are the importance of engaging community at different modalities. And so that's part of what we'll talk about today, is we'll talk about ways that we can sort of leverage some of everybody's increased digital sort of access points and literacy to help us to engage communities in providing insights into public health. How do we think about having communities be not only included, but in many ways at the forefront of storytelling around public health issues, advocacy, and ultimately practice in many ways. So that's part of what we'll talk about today. So I mentioned myself, I have been a chair here at Native American Studies the last year. And part of the reason of that is because of my aforementioned advocacy, they just have been struggling a bit more as a department, and having we've had a number of people retire and take other positions, and we've had some struggles with having enough faculty actually across some of our units in our campus. So I've been helping out here, but that'll kind of be reflected in some of the content I have today, because I've been really as a public health person, right, really listening and interested in how we can inform some of our methods with cultural perspectives. And culture, very widely defined, I think, in terms of public health. I teach multicultural public health as well as American Indian health issues on our campus. And I've done that for, well, quite a number of years. And some of the things I've learned is just how we all have, a culture that we are kind of living within and knowledgeable of. And that can be, here in Montana, very, very frequently, we talk a lot about rural health and rural culture here in Montana in our courses, and thinking about some of the ways that our lack of access to care, healthcare, education, those sorts of things can have a real impact on health within our state. And so that's one example. Here we think about American Indian, Alaska Native communities, but also this applies to disability. This applies to different ability here in our state, as well as we think about our communities that may have special needs in terms of health and education population, and folks who may vary along the income spectrum as well. So we have folks, both here in Missoula and throughout Montana, that may have differential kind of levels of access to many different things based on their income. And so some of the things that we'll talk about today will focus on American Indian communities, because that's where we see some of the kind of more glaring disparities within our state. However, these are really things that can and have been used with other populations as well. And so that kind of is something I'm hoping that everybody will start to think about, and just develop that curiosity as to how some of these methods, how some of these principles or philosophies in public health could apply to your work as well. So that'll be kind of the frame for today. Next week, we're going to start looking at, I was just looking at the chat. Oh, great. Okay. Oh, Yellowstone Boys and Girls Club. Okay, great. Oh, this will see. I'm so glad you're working with Native Record Services. Okay, great. And looking to expand onto some of our reservation. Oh, great. And Denise, you've done digital storytelling. Okay, great. And you're volunteering internationally. Great, wonderful. This is awesome, great. Well, I think this is going to be a wonderful discussion, and I mean, this is the first one is going to be a little bit of setting the frame and setting a little bit of a look into the literature and how we think about health and the history of kind of our communities. And then the second workshop next week will be a little bit more of an applied, like actually how to use some of the software, how to access some of these at low price points, ideally sometimes no cost price points for not only for each of you as public health practitioners, but also for folks that you work with, and helping people to tell their stories. And that's a powerful thing in public health as we think about advocacy, as we think about also just informing our communities that we're working with, and having them, more importantly, inform those who are providing services and building structures that are providing healthcare. So those are really wonderful. So in my time here, most of my work has been in community and public health sciences. I was also had a shared appointment in pharmacy practice because of my background being more of a clinical person in terms of training. So that'll kind of be reflected as we talk today. And please, feel free to interrupt if you have questions or put them in the chat, and Emily will help me, monitoring that as well. Okay, so moving, into our presentation, hopefully. As we think about today's agenda, so really thinking about setting that frame, digital engagement is really what we're thinking about. We're thinking about narrative and how we think about bringing other people into not only the conversation, but in some ways at the forefront of these discussions. And so story is a really powerful way that can engage. And I'll provide some examples of things that I've used within my work and within Emily's work and others here on our campus and within our communities. And it's really a way that we can enhance many of our prevention and health promotion efforts. And so, you know, some of the things that we'll look at are more research oriented kind of applications, but then also, you know, the bulk of this work has been from community engagement, community empowerment, looking at Indigenous communities across the globe and how we think about promoting and thinking about health. So that's going to be some of our discussion today, and it's going to be really exciting to think about the background. And for each of you, I'd encourage you just to like maybe jot down notes about things that you would like to think about in terms of applying some of these tools. And so next week, we'll kind of review some of the tools. And then the third week, we'll start to actually, you know, so you'll have some of the tools of how to create some of these new public health tools. And then the third, we'll kind of look at sharing and finding ways to kind of looking at having examples of this in real time. So that's kind of a little bit of a sneak peek into the applied practice week. So this is all going to kind of build on each other, and it's going to be an exciting thing. So in terms of what digital storytelling is, it really just depends on who you're asking, right? As we're thinking about many of our cultures, including many of our Indigenous communities, our cultures are very much a spoken word culture, oral history being a big important part of that. And as we move forward, as you know, speaking to elders from our community, you know, we start to use media, right? And so I was just watching a documentary the other night about Katharine Hepburn and her life, you know, spanned from her film work in the 1930s, you know, up until, you know, the late 1990s, and looking at her, you know, span of life, thinking about the ways that she was able to leverage, you know, her work as a businesswoman and all these different kind of aspects. So if you look at any culture, you know, you can think about ways that we begin to incorporate media into our storytelling. And so, you know, public health is you know, no different than other fields in that way, in that we can use these different media to really supplement our ability to have outreach in different ways. So that includes audio. So we think about podcasts and how popular that they have become. And I will show you next week some examples of some podcast software that you can use, or you can, you know, show folks how to use. So many of them are free. And those are things that are really exciting. I've started to kind of develop some podcast work as well. And I'll show you some examples of how podcasts can be constructed and built, you know, in ways that are low cost. Visually, sometimes we think about like performing arts, and we think about, you know, those things being really important as we think about public health. So we think about, you know, sometimes the emotional impact of some of the health disparity literature that we may look at. You know, one of the things we're seeing more of, especially following the pandemic, is incorporation of virtual worlds, right? We had researchers come here from New Zealand, and they were interested in doing this like really cool interactive museum where you would have like your phone or what have you, and it would link to these like massive digital, resources where you would, play games on your phone in real space, sort of like if any of you or your kids, I know Emily and I both for a while were playing Pokemon Go, right? So we'd see each other at the Pokemon Go stops here in town, and they do those similar things for public health questions, right? And so, when we're thinking about things like the natural world, there's research coming out now looking at our exposure to green space. Some of our researchers here are doing some of that work. We've looked at also there's a researcher, I was just at a conference in Boston at MIT 2 weeks ago, and a colleague of mine from the University of Washington over at Seattle is doing telomere research, where he's actually looking at green exposure to like different, well, they're from trees, actually, like different kinds of like cells from trees. And they're doing like pre-post testing on folks when they have green exposure. And in his situation, he's actually putting helmets on them and controlling and piping in the amount of exposure to these telomeres, these like green kind of plant kind of substances, and looking at how that impacts cognition and things. So all of these things really do map to applied research that's really built on what we know from this public health science. And we think about how that influences, our health on a daily basis. So multimedia is just a combination, right? Audiovisual things. When we think about, we think about things like video, we think about short films, we think about documentary films. As we've all been through the pandemic, documentary films for many of us has been a really interesting and helpful way for us to think about, our lives and the lives of people who may live very differently than we do, and how we inform our communications with each other. So those are some cool things that we think about, and they really map on to many of our communities and our community needs. So those some of the things that we'll talk about today. When we think about Native communities in Montana, I grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation in northwestern Montana, and I went to high school there, went to middle school, and one of the things that is a surprise sometimes to folks is that I learned very little about my community while I was growing up in the formal school settings. I learned a lot more, of course, at home, but in terms of our history, that is something that was not taught within our schools. And it wasn't really until I came to college where I started to learn some of that history more. And so I wanted to share this photo as we're thinking about story, because this is a photo of my actual great grandfather, basically. So his name was Chief Bull, or Richard Sanderville, and he was one of the first interpreters for the Blackfeet tribe. And so this is a quote from him that I came upon very recently, and it wasn't until very recently also that I knew he was a relative of mine. And so it's been a really cool full circle moment to kind of learn about public health, and then learn about history, and learn about how those things kind of come together. So this is part of what I think the importance of storytelling can be, is as we think about some really complex problems that we'll talk about today, like we talk about substance abuse, we talk about, adolescent health, education, you name it. A lot of those conditions and health issues have real deep roots. And so I start a little bit with history just to orient us as we think about health and equity in Montana. When we think about health inequity, it's very much tied to many factors, some of those including different, access to land and income, and all of these different kind of things that traditionally many Native people have had struggles with, honestly. So we've seen the creation of the reservation system. We've seen the boarding school era where many of children were removed. For example, Richard Sanderville was placed in Carlisle Indian School, which is in Pennsylvania, and he was born here in Montana, and had spent a couple of years in boarding school and during the early 1900s. And at that time, he actually seem to have had a pretty good experience in that. But, unlike many people, many Native people, it was a very negative chapter in our history. And it leads to the second point here. I talk about, a lot of systemic problems that we see within our reservation and our Native communities, and a lot of them really requiring systemic solutions. So today we'll talk about one small domain of those systemic solutions. But I wanted to talk about that in terms of public health a little bit, about what are some of the other ways that we can think about, kind of informing our public health solutions. And then I wanted to mention, we've been doing this cool collaboration with our astronomy and physics department here on campus. And so we here at it's called the Payne Family Native American Center building here on campus, we have a planetarium downstairs. And I've been trying to think of a way. What I might do is try to record a little bit of it so I can show you next time what that looks like. I wish there was a way we could share it with you virtually here, but it's an immersive experience because it is a planetarium, and myself and other faculty have learned how to operate the planetarium, and it's been a really cool experience because in terms of public health, there's so much messaging that can be really powerfully conveyed within that setting, because it talks about not only our history, our culture, our creation stories, but also how that applies to now. And so one of the stories is about the bunch stars, and the stories in this particular story is about many things, including recovering from things like COVID-19, things like coping with bullying, all these things that really have public health implications. And so that kind of Indigenous revitalization that we're seeing currently is something that is very hopeful for a lot of our communities. And so that's what I mentioned here. The term for the Blackfeet is Igakima, which is basically trying hard, kind of perseverance, and also resiliency development. So that's sort of, part of what I find very hopeful in public health as we think about storytelling and how we have building inclusive narratives is really the theme. So when we lead with history, and I share this photo of one of our recent graduates, Deshane, who is finished his PhD. It's kind of a digitized version, so it's my Instagram-y version. But he graduated with his PhD last year from our public health program, and he, like I, come from a Native community, and we actually come from the same tribe, and one part of our tribal affiliation background. But when we think about history, we think about Native people, we think about all people. There have been so many pandemics that we've all kind of experienced as a historical, community. And those have been biological, things like, the bubonic plague, and, more recently, COVID-19. Social, we've seen things like racial discrimination that has really impacted many communities. Economic, we're in the current throes of that in many ways with regard to housing and some of the struggles that people have in affording, cost of living, like places here like Missoula and Bozeman and Billings and many of the places that you all are joining us from. So for Native people as well, because of the boarding school era and many of the different things, if you've heard any Native presentation ever before, they will inevitably talk about boarding school and how the federal government had basically stated that the philosophy was to kill the Indian and save the child. And so that really was like that idea that culture was something that was bad and that needed to be sort of eradicated within people. And we had to sort of be in a melting pot, and sort of like the goal was to be very much the same, but through that, there have been media and narratives that have really portrayed Native people as well as other communities in a really negative light, and to be different and to be other is to be somehow dangerous or to be at the minimum viewed with distrust or like as not the same. So for many Native people, we really struggle with that, to be honest. A lot of the stats that we hear about high suicide rates, substance abuse, those kinds of things within Native communities in Montana. A lot of it is an outcome of these kind of historical factors, where we have a lot of ingrained systematic discrimination that we've experienced. So we see sustained discrimination as part of the history in not only Montana, but the United States. And then we also see internalized forms of that and things like lateral violence. And I'm happy to share with you like some videos around lateral violence. We see this not only among Native people, we see this in many walks of life, many professional domains and those sorts of things. And it can be really insidious if you've ever experienced workforce bullying or, any kind of different, dysfunctions that can happen there. Lack of access to care, language and cultural warfare. So language, what I talk about there is like, in 1978, so that's 4 years into my lifetime was when we as Native people gained a right to practice our religion and speak our languages. And before that, it was illegal. And Native people, that's a really pretty recent time frame where those things were changing. So this is my Native American Studies slide in one slide. But we see that for Native people, we had a real sudden population collapse. A lot of that was disease. And so for those of you who are knowledgeable about public health history, you'll know that things like the smallpox epidemic really hit our Indigenous communities very hard. We had starvation times when the traditional food sources or traditional things like bison here in the West and other places were almost eradicated. And so we had people really, starving in our state. And for a lot of people, this genocide and systematic discrimination was really destructive at that early stage and continues to be in many ways too. But then we had for Native and American Indian, Alaska Native folks relocation. We had efforts to eradicate communities or terminate. And then we started to see cycles of violence towards self. And so as a psychologist, these are some of the things that I've kind of really focused on is how do we think about interacting to interrupt these cycles and getting people to view themselves with more compassion and those sorts of things. And so that's where digital storytelling kind of comes in, is really as we think about how do we disrupt these patterns so that we can have communities and individuals have healthier lives. And so this is where we're kind of looking at and cultural, what we're calling it resistance. So like for those Star Wars fans out there, just making sure you're still with us. But as we think about strengths, it is something that we're trying to think very carefully about as far as things like digital storytelling. Oftentimes when you do workshops with communities, they'll want to talk about cultural preservation, want to talk about language, healing, revitalization. And a lot of that is through education, community building, looking at the ways more communal cultures think about interdependence and like your success is my success and vice versa. For many people, not only Native, but following the pandemic, people have really looked towards sources of hope and belief. And so parts of that may be spirituality, renewal of identity for many people is a really important thing. And as I mentioned with our star stories, we have we actually as Blackfeet people, we have songs for the sun, we have songs for the moon, stars, Milky Way, Earth, everything in it, and including all the different like non-human and human animals within our sort of universe. And so this may seem like it is not applying in some ways, but really this is kind of the heart of what we think about in inclusive storytelling. We think about those other realities and how we think about sharing some of that experience with others. So this is kind of the question, and what I'm going to shift to after this is I'm going to try to share a video with you. beta tested this a little bit, so we're hoping that this works. But the kind of critical question is like, when we'll look through some of the health concerns that we have briefly. But when we think about wanting systematic or systemic changes for communities, we think about scientific equity, right? We think about how do we include communities who may need the science and the research most, but also balancing. In many ways, a community has a need for sort of dignity, with regard to some of these health statistics, but also balancing that with how do we actually carve down to look at what are the causal factors for difficult questions or topics, right? And so a lot of times, like, I'll come into communities, even as a Native person, and people will really want me to just really emphasize the good news, the resiliency factors, the strengths, the different things. And I'm happy to do so. But in order to do that, you have to have what we call a dialectic. You kind of balance that really positive information and ways that you move forward in a strength-based approach with an acknowledgement of what is wrong and some of the things that are more difficult to talk about. And so, a lot of that stems to what we think of as like bravery, and how we think about, storytelling that is in some ways hopefully transformative for folks as we think about engaging youth and engaging folks. And so this is just like an interesting photo too, because this is Mountain Chief. And if you know the Blackfeet history, he was a real significant chief from the kind of early 1900s, and some of his work being preserved by an ethnographer. And I also had the opportunity to recently find some of these songs, and they're located at the University of California, Berkeley. And so in terms of my digital storytelling work, I've been starting to kind of get curious about like words and song and language and how these things kind of pertain to public health and things. So it's been kind of a cool journey. So let me see if this will work. Okay, so this is a video that we had created with the Nimiipuu, or the Nez Perce community. And this is one that we had worked on as part of our air quality study, where we were doing an intervention for Native communities that had wood stoves. And one of the things that we did is that we wanted to look at how we could engage communities around thinking about best burn practices based on the EPA standards of wood stove use. And so this is a video that we created as an introductory video. And so this has kind of been used both in kind of the science side of things, as well as sort of the cultural community engagement side. So we'll take a look at this, and hopefully.
Nimiipuu stories tell of many relationships between the people, also known as the Nez Perce, and the land, water, animals, and spiritual world. Storytelling, family, and spirituality are the backbone of the culture and the Nimiipuu world. Fire and smoke are an important part of familial and cultural life for the Nimiipuu. There are positive cultural factors relating to fire. There is a medicinal value to smoke. This value is spiritual, physiological, and part of our traditional ceremonies and ways of life. As kids, we were raised in homes with wood stoves. We would harvest tamarack trees as a family out in the mountains. Many of our families make a living from harvesting wood, and it is a way we can also save money. Many of our elders are on limited incomes, and they depend upon firewood to get them through the winter. It is important that we recognize and respect the importance of wood stoves, smoke, and fire. Our stories tell of a boy long ago who used a bow and an arrow to capture fire from the black buckskin bags in the sky. This boy put his entire spirit into making the arrow straight and sharp. He fletched it with feathers from the bird that flew the highest, and secured the point to the arrow with cedar bark. He wore a necklace made of a white shell around his neck, and he placed it on the ground when the black buckskin bags were overhead. He shot one of the bags, and the arrow fell to the earth like a falling star. The arrow struck the white shell he placed on the ground, and it has been touched with the colors of fire ever since. All were thankful because now they could cook their food and warm their children and elders. When they looked for the boy, he was gone. He had exchanged himself for the knowledge of how to make a fire with a bow drill. The white shell that was touched with the colors of fire is now called abalone. We still use that shell to burn potosue and cedar for our homes and to pray. Abalone is the keeper of the fire, and we wear it to this day in remembrance of the boy who sacrificed his life for the Nimipu to become stewards of fire. Treating fire and wood stoves respectfully is important to promote health and preserve our way of life. Too much smoke in the home can cause coughing, wheezing, or other breathing problems. This introduction video is the first of 3 videos we are creating to find ways to use wood stoves efficiently while reducing wood smoke within the home. The second video in the series provides recommendations on how to prepare your firewood before it is burned in your wood stove. The third video provides recommendations on how to optimize wood burning within your home. In addition to these videos, you will also be provided with individual instructions and written materials to help ensure you are using your wood stove efficiently and safely. These tips will help you save time, money, and reduce wood smoke exposure within your home. Together we can continue to be stewards of fire and teach future generations how to continue our culture in good ways.
So that's just the first example, because I wanted to show you just a little bit about how, what this looks like. It's easy to talk about it, and it's better to like get an example of how we think about, these different factors. So are there things that you noticed within that film? You can feel free to jump into the chat about that. I could tell you a little bit. So I know from talking to our partners in the tribe, and just from my own reflections, there was a lot I learned. Just, and I'm like again, a Native person, but we're not born knowing these things, but like, just some of the things in this process that I learned were really helpful, including, even something like as complicated as like using wood stove in the home, right? On the one hand, it's pretty straightforward, but on the other hand, there's a lot that goes into it, right? And like the fact that they have, as a tribe, really very specific uses for certain trees, and so the subsequent videos kind of show a little bit about that. Yeah, same, Denise. So I think we all have kind of heard of tobacco being sacred and being kind of a natural plant medicine, and that being really complicated, right? As we think about how do we sort of maintain it being a sacred plant use, but not, being, as we know, commercial tobacco smoke is really tied to cancer in different ways, really complex ways, as well as other health problems and things. So yes, mindful, definitely very mindful. And one of the things that we also, so there's the piece about how do we do harm reduction? And so that's really what we're kind of thinking about when we're thinking about the public health side of things. So we know people are going to use tobacco in ceremonies, as they should, but how do we think about maybe looking at intervening with more recreational uses of tobacco? Similarly with the wood stoves, people are going to use wood stoves in their homes, as of course many people should, right? But how do we do that in a way that is going to minimize any potential unnecessary exposure to what we know to be sometimes bad for our health, like the particulate matter. But I love, Denise, where you're saying the purpose, but is that that building that mindful process into the use of wood stove use. And so that was I'm hoping we were able to kind of capture some of that in our videos. And the other thing too, this is just the anecdote, right? But in terms of the cultural side of things, yes, care and respect, exactly. So when we worked with, there's Josiah, I think I always mix up. I think his name is Josiah. Anyway, he was working for the tribe with their cultural. He narrates the video, and when we were working with him, I spoke with him about are there stories of how fire came to the community, and kind of historical, cultural creation stories essentially. And he really led us to some stories that could be shared within the videos. And so and those stories came directly from anthropological texts, which is really interesting. And so he helped to draft kind of a way of telling that story in a short way, um, and also a more kind of culturally grounded way. And so we of course the story is much richer in the shared oral history, but for the purposes of our video, we told a little very shortened version of that story. And when we shared the videos, and when people in the community shared the videos, what they were told by elders and others within the community was that they had been very grateful, because they felt like some of those stories had been lost within their community. Many of them had not heard those stories before. And so, in terms of the public health, like cultural preservation piece, those two can really go hand in hand, as we think about health. And how do we think about, exactly as you're saying, how do we think about care and respect and like those kinds of aspects of health, especially when we're talking about some of these issues of like things like smoking or wood stove use, or things that we know that there could be some risk associated with those practices. So that's one example. As I mentioned, I will show you how to do some of the construction of some of that next time. A lot of it is, as you can see, is you develop a script. You work with community members to kind of have about a page and a half of single spaced Word document, right? And that may sound like a lot, but it may be even double spaced, but it's really it forces you to be really quite concise when you're working in this medium. And so as we think about that script writing, think about that over the next week, as far as like if you're working. I know some of you are working in like with youth, for example. What are some ways that we can think about engaging, like I know one of you works for the Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch, right? So maybe there's things that you wanted to talk about, equine therapy, for example. What does that look like? How could that be helpful to communities? How, horses are something that for many Native people are, a really important part of our history. We have things like we have rodeo, and we have the Indian relay races and things like that, and things that are happening now, right? And that, but to be a part of many of these communities and processes, you have to like really live a life that's pretty disciplined in some ways, right? So you can start to message some of the public health things that about, maybe it's combining with suicide prevention, maybe it's looking at substance abuse prevention or treatment, those kinds of things that we can think about. So those kinds of things are things that we do when we do digital storytelling construction. And I'm going to go back to my little slides. Any questions anybody has right now? So this is kind of, what the kind of interplay is as we think about being a public health educator, is a lot of what this is. And we think about like kind of having different ways of telling that story. So for all of us are working in Montana, so we know, it is in many ways a very diverse state. In some ways, it's not a very diverse state, but in many ways, culturally, we think about the different communities we have in our state and the different reservation communities, very, very rich in terms of Indigenous histories, in terms of Indigenous cultures, and we think about our tribal communities. 6 to 7% of our total population is American Indian people. Our tribal nations are included here, and you see, I try to include where possible more the Indigenous language, which is a lot of times people will ask me, should I say Native American? Should I say American Indian? Should I say Indigenous? And, I thought the answer is, yes, but it also depends, because for many Native people, they prefer that they have the use of their actual native language, included. So for like the Chippewa, sometimes that's the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, depending on where you are in the United States. For Blackfeet, Amskapi, Piikani, and the Blackfeet I know more about since that's part of my lineage. But we have the Blackfoot Confederacy, right? And that's, divided by the international boundary with Canada. And so we have more bands in Canada. The Amskapi Piikani are the ones who are here in Montana. And so like being knowledgeable about some of those things can be really helpful for public health practitioners, because especially if you're working in an urban area, you're likely to interact with, folks from all of these different tribal communities and oftentimes in the same person, because we have a lot more intertribal marriage and we have a lot more cultural diversity within our communities as well. So this is just a kind of a snapshot of that. When we think about the public health side of things, this was from a study that came out in 2000. So it's an older study, but we know it's, demographically not changed a great deal over time. We see the bottom row here is Montana statistics with regard to health and indices of poverty, overall poverty rate, and then we compare that to all of our reservation communities. We see a very apparent difference in terms of resources, in terms of poverty distribution. It's not randomly distributed in the state of Montana. It's actually very much tied to race, for one thing, gender as well. And so we think about our communities of color in our state, and those primarily being our reservation communities, we see pretty clear differences in terms of people being able to heat their homes, have enough food, pay for their expenses on the daily basis, those sorts of things. And all of these things from a public health side, we know correspond to social determinants of health, and that corresponds to health outcomes for our people in not only here in Montana but across the globe. And so when we teach this in our public health courses, we really emphasize the need to although tools and helping to improve public health are incredibly important, but also work on the advocacy side to begin to decrease some of the differences that we see that are based on race and that are based on gender and those sorts of things. So this impacts health in very significant ways here in Montana. One is that we have Native people living shorter lives, often lives that are more difficult. We have the highest suicide rate in the state. Montana as a state has a very high rate. We have high levels of exposure to environmental stressors. So as we think about the flooding right now, people who have lower incomes, are more likely to live in floodplains throughout the country, as well as when we think about there's been a drought for many communities in our rural areas. So those kinds of things can really, and of course we're all mindful of wildfire smoke, right? And so right now, the last couple of weeks, we've been experiencing wildfire smoke from Canada. And we know from our colleagues here on our campus and elsewhere that exposure to consistent air pollutants will impact health over time. When we think about Native communities, we also think about overcrowded homes, and when we think about these will start to sound familiar as we think about the pandemic and the impacts it's had on communities of color. Lack of access to clean water, plumbing, power. And then even prior to the pandemic, we had higher rates of comorbid chronic morbidity, things like type 2 diabetes, things like breathing problems of different varieties, early onset of pneumonia and asthma, those sorts of things. So when we think about these factors, they do correspond to pretty significant impact on American Indian communities. And so this is corresponds to our discussion today, because hopefully you can see this okay. And I apologize if you're colorblind, but the top line basically, you'll see this first figure is figure 2 here, and this came from the CDC data around the pandemic. And we see age-adjusted cases, and this is from April 2020, so very early in the pandemic, to July of 2022. And throughout, you see the highest line there is American Indian, Alaska Native, both for onset of the illness, and then mortality rates as well. And that kind of really peaked in 2021 when we saw a lot of mortality. And part of the reason we think for this is that some of the factors I just talked about, like the overcrowded housing, lack of plumbing, lack of electricity, energy insecurity, and then the comorbid health conditions that Native people experience. But this is also, higher amongst other communities of color as well. So you could see here to kind of compare those. One of the things that I personally am interested in is also violence. And as we think about Native people here in our state and throughout the nation, more likely to experience lifetime violence. And so we see that is similar across gender. We see women having higher levels of different forms of assaultive violence. And this is really important as we think about, oh, sorry, went a little too fast. Oh, whoops. I don't know if I can go back. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and go back to my slide here. But this is a good time to oh, thank you for adding the Northern Cheyenne term. I will add that to my talk too. So I wanted to show a video a little bit again, along with today being a theme of showing you some examples. And this next video is from a student of mine who actually just a couple of years ago finished his master's in, I think it was in counseling. So he's become a professional counselor in the Spokane area, and his name is Roger LaPlante. And he was in one of my classes years ago and created a digital story as part of the course. And so he's given me permission to show that video. So I wanted to show that as another example of more of a community-based video, so that you can take a look at that.
O Kinaskani on Skapi Pakani. My name is Roger LaPlante, and today I would like to talk about my journey and what historical trauma has meant in my life. During one frigid winter morning, I was sitting at my computer in a bedroom in my dad's house. I was severely depressed and feeling sad. Here I was, at 28 years old, working a dead-end job on the reservation with no education and no hope for my future. How did I end up here? And what does the future hold for me? Were just some of the questions that ran through my mind that cold November morning. As everyone slept, I turned on the computer and began to search the internet for answers. I stumbled across a term that intrigued me: historical trauma. What is historical trauma? And how does it relate to me? My eyes became glued to the screen. I read about depression, fear, anger, sadness, and anxiety that are a result of genocide, colonization, and assimilation. My tribe, the Blackfeet, were among those impacted. I asked myself, could the depression and anxiety I have been feeling be symptoms of historical trauma? I read about how my ancestors were torn away from their families as children and forced into boarding schools where they experienced emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. They were stripped of their identities, their hair was cut, their names were changed, and they were forbidden to speak their language. In essence, they were told that being an Indian was a bad thing. As the winter wind howled against the frozen window pane, I realized in that moment how much could be explained by historical trauma in my personal life. Alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, child neglect, disease had become some kind of social norm in my community and among my people. I remembered the teachings of my great-grandmother and other respected elders in my community, so I knew these negative aspects of life on the reservation were not a part of my culture, but were a result of historical trauma. I asked myself, if historical trauma were so powerful, then why am I here today? I realized it's because my ancestors were strong, resilient people who had my survival in mind. I also realized in that moment the name that was given to me by them, Rising Wolf. I have always shared my Indian name with others, but without feeling any true meaning behind it. But as I sat in reflection that morning, I realized just how much my family sacrificed for me, and by having this name, I was meant to rise above historical trauma. Because of an innate belief in myself and my desire for a better life, I knew some things needed to change. Thanks to the love and support I received from my family, friends, and mentors, I have been able to start my journey towards healing and education. Through culture and spirituality, I continue to have renewed strength to endure the winters of my life. I left my father's house, I obtained my GED in May of 2011 and was enrolled in college that same year. I went from being a depressed high school dropout to achieving a 4.0 GPA and making the Dean's List at the University of Montana since stepping foot on campus. Today, I am that rising wolf. The healed spirits of my ancestors are within me as I bring healing to my community and create new pathways that others can follow. I have learned that overcoming historical trauma isn't a one-time event. It is something that needs to be worked on continuously. Thankfully, I have the same tools and skills that my ancestors used that ensured my survival. And winter is nothing more than just that. Winter. Another season to make it through. And I know I can make it through any storm. I have done it before.
So these are some of the folks who helped with like photos and but it kind of shows to you a little bit about why we talk about history when we're thinking about Native communities and kind of the relevance to the health disparities that many of you are working with in your public health work. I wanted to follow up on that. And I know I focus on the Blackfeet community just because that's where a lot of my work has been done. But a lot of these factors could also apply to other tribal communities, not only in our state, but other places that I've also done research and things with other communities. But one of the things I wanted to mention here with regard to some of the science around storytelling and how we look at qualitative data pertains to a study that we had done just a few years ago. We're working on some papers around this right now. But one of the things we did is we developed a Indigenous environmental exposure assessment. And it had two scales. Basically, there was a social stressor scale and more of a climate-based, climate change, like severe weather, drought kind of exposure scale. And what we looked at is the relationship between those forms of exposure, those two forms of exposure, and health, mental health, culture, and resiliency. And then we looked at also what we call biomarkers. So we looked at blood pressure. We actually measured A1C levels for those who might have metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes, that sort of thing. So A1C would look at, those kinds of, and we also looked at BMI, calculated BMIs for folks and things. So there's an interesting study in that we looked also at qualitative pieces. And so we're hoping to do some, again, digital storytelling and podcast type of work following this study. But I wanted to just briefly talk to you about some of the findings because it pertains to the work in public health that each of you do. One of the things that we know, and this is maybe in a psychologist too, right? But we know that trauma exposure is associated with poorer health in different ways. So depression, PTSD, and distress levels. And so in the video that Roger shared, he talks about some of this. He talks about historical trauma in particular and how those things tie to depression and for many PTSD symptoms and also environmental exposure. So we looked also at hypertension, and when we looked at that as being associated with things like physical stressors. And so, there's been some other studies that have looked at other forms of stress, including discriminatory stress here in Montana, and how that's also had similar patterns of relationships between these factors. So when we think about resiliency and we think about culture and reframing it as a protective factor, part of what we're looking at with storytelling and with looking at expansive ways of providing these messages is that, we know from the science that these things do matter in terms of culture, language, and health. Those who participated in ceremonies and the studies that we did were less likely to have depression symptoms. Okan, which is our medicine lodge, is, or some people might call it Sundance ceremony. Those who participated in that had a high consistent pattern of relationship to protective factors. So they're more likely to have higher self-esteem, more likely to have resiliency factors that they were able to access, lower levels of depression, PTSD, those sorts of things. And that was really hopeful message to find within the research, and thinking about, people really engaged in some of these traditional ecological knowledge practices, things like gathering plant medicines for food, for teas, for ceremonies. We have a thing called berry soup that we have at many of our ceremonies, and so a lot of folks will go out as a family and collect berries and things. And that kind of also speaks to some of these protective factors, not social wise. We have ways of kind of interacting that are not on a screen and that are like, that are helping us to feel like, as a community that we have support, which I think many of us are seeking now as we move forward in this time of what we call post-traumatic growth, following the pandemic. And so, with regard to culture, it was interesting because the sample was almost all Native American, right? So half of the sample spoke or were learning Blackfeet, 30% attended the Okan or the Medicine Lodge, and then about the same attended pipe ceremony, sweat lodge, or other ceremonies. And so, that was really an interesting factor that we're seeing, that development itself was really sort of, for many people, being shaped by culture. And so we think about that with regard to storytelling. And as we think about images, how they can really convey a lot within our stories, right? And so one of the things I personally have been doing during the pandemic is yes, I made sourdough bread, and I have a starter if anybody needs any, but hopefully it's alive. It's been like a little bit, but then also I've been teaching myself to sew and those kinds of things in my off time, and then doing like some leather working. Like this is my first beta little test belt, and but for many Native people as well as people throughout our state, we've all been kind of looking at finding ways to kind of create what we call in psychology like meaning making, right? So things that are kind of tied to who we are as a person, our identity, and this is crosses any kind of made up boundary that we may have in different ways, because we are all kind of like looking for that in many ways. So this is something that we think about when we think about storytelling, is we think about how do we tell that story. This other story is one coming from the University of Washington. They did, I did a secondary data analysis of data that they had collected from our same community, Blackfeet community here in Montana. And what they looked at was similar. They looked at depression, suicidal ideation, PTSD. And one of the things they found was that everyday discrimination was a key factor in predicting each of the domains of risk that they looked at, including association that we know between adverse childhood experiences. So those who had experienced everyday discrimination, and remember, this is a primarily all Native American sample, so they're experiencing a lot of it from within the community. And so that was one of the more predictive factors. So when we think about what can be done, this is where public health really comes in. We think about trauma as one being a piece, and many of you are engaged in this work. We think about trauma-informed systems and interventions for individuals and community, public safety. We think about compassion too, and that's something that is not often overtly spoken about within public health, but it's really something that we're trying to develop, not only for communities who may need help, but also for individuals who are looking to overcome mental health challenges and those sorts of things. A lot of that is, really tied to the way that we think about supporting ourselves. And that's where storytelling can come in, as we think about building supports. We think about culture, ceremony, language, housing, education, economies, all these different things that are really interrelated, especially when we think about them cross-culturally. Oops, I got too fancy on the slide. It always kind of freezes up on me. Okay. Service needs, really. So science is one big part of that. And we know from a lot of our colleagues here at our campus, are funded through NIH and different sources that are really looking to advance science in ways that are inclusive, and public health is part of that as well. I mentioned advocacy and things like today, where we're looking at provider training, and we're looking at how do we better inform systems and engage people in storytelling. So this is a story that I wanted to share, and I hope you're getting the theme that there's different ways to tell stories, right? Because that's part of the way I structured this talk today, is that as we think about, again, for the Blackfoot Confederacy, and this is one thing, like I talk about the Blackfeet, and just in terms of that's how I grew up, but also I just feel a little bit less nervous speaking about other tribes, because they have different ways, and each of them are very different and unique. But as we think about, the interconnection piece, and how do we break this into ways that we can think about this from a public health perspective? So for many tribes, like we think about the Salish and, others that have trickster stories, like the coyote stories you may have heard of, and those are told at times when there's snow on the ground for many of the Salish and for the Kootenai folks. For Blackfeet, you often hear of the Napi stories. And Napi stories are stories of what we know as this old man, or Napi, and he's very much a trickster figure. And one of the things in talking to elders that people have advised is that we expand our narrative. Napi is a very important part of that, and he talks about some of our creation stories and is very involved with that. But we also have other stories that are important and influence the way that we think about working together. And one of those is the story of Makoyi, which is the Wolf Trail or the Milky Way. Katoyes is another, and that's one of our Blackfeet superheroes, actually. So he sort of would be like, he had a little dog and he basically saved the Blackfeet from things like what we call, I'm trying to think of the term for it, but frogman being one, and snakes, different types of snake, not stories. I'm trying to think of how to describe this, but it's actually like dinosaurs. So if you think about that, like you think about back in that time, you know, there's a lot of fossils throughout Montana, and they actually had stories of how, you know, those they found those, fossil, and how they made sense of that. And one of the ways was the stories of Katoyes and how he helped the Blackfeet in times of struggle and things. For the Blackfeet, we also have what we call medicine bundles and their spirit being. So that's included in this little image. But when we think about, I wanted to use the example of the Milky Way or the Wolf Trail. So the story goes is that after the Blackfeet are also called the Nisitapi, were created, they were starving, and this is, at a time when we used to say that we could talk to animals, and we still do for many people, but and the wolf people had pity on us and became human for a winter, and they taught us how to hunt or to gather medicine. And the key here from a public health perspective is that they work together, right? Everybody had a role, all the people had a role of working together. And that was really the key to survival and to renewal. It's like living in relationship with each other, and ways that we looked at ceremony reflected that. And it's in our language. The language is a very verb-based language instead of being a noun-based language, like the English language. So at the end, the wolves left and became stars of the Milky Way to remind us of how we live together. And so a lot of public health messaging within our tribal communities and tribal histories. Similarly, for our community, we think about this term for compassion. And so for a public health perspective, we think about culture as being part of that healing process, and how place-based education and place-based knowledge is part of that that information that we think about from a public health perspective. So we think about built environment. And so we've had people do digital stories on the built environment, the environmental, place-based knowledge, building better playgrounds, having better access to walking paths or different things of that nature. So these things can be really expansively understood as we think about storytelling and education, art, signs, for many of our communities, it's really kind of looking at how do we build inclusive systems that begin to have more health equity, and how do we invest in science in ways that increases access for all people in this way. And so that's part of what we think about with digital storytelling, is we think about, are there ways that we can work with the community itself, empower them with the tools so that they can speak to how culture is part of the healing and public health kind of process for their community. How is language part of that? Is identity part of that? And part of this is, when I teach in our campus public health courses, we think about, the way that we approach community engagement that matters so much. And so if you go into a community as an outsider and say, I'm here to prevent suicide, the chances of you having a really positive and engaged response by the community are pretty small. If you just came in from the outside, right? And part of that is multifaceted. One is we have, we have a lot more knowledge about community engagement and ways to do that respectfully and in a reciprocal way. And we think about ways to engage communities. So if you did that same project, still funded by SAMHSA or wherever, to do suicide prevention, but instead you reframed it as a wellness, approach, and then you talk to elders, you talk to people from the community, you have people who are, partnering within that process. That's why with the digital storytelling, we've had some really, good and sustained partnerships built from that, is because we've provided workshops. We came in, we said, we're going to have like a workshop for some of your youth and like 10 to 12 people. And we actually like do a 3-day workshop where we teach them how to do the video construction, all the way from the script development to the shot list, to gathering the media, to constructing it in, a software package, and then sharing that video with the community. And that has been a much more successful pathway to do the same ends, right? We're still trying to create wellness and look at, it might be substance abuse prevention or suicide prevention or things like that, but it's messaged differently. The practices are different. You're looking at building that engagement and trust and reciprocal kind of ways of practicing public health, which is really, the heart of what, we're trying to do when we think about using tools, because tools are only tools unless we really can use them in ways that that we, are being good partners, and that's part of what we're thinking about. So that's part of what we're thinking about when we think about digital storytelling. So really, how can we live for Blackfeet, for other communities, in ways that have been taught to us, through our oral history, through our storytelling tradition. And it's a really compassion forward approach. We think about moving, to our communities, healing through different ways. And so this is an image from my oldest daughter, and she is also a storyteller. She's a filmmaker. She's written for television and film, and she has produced some shows. And I'll show you next time one of her shows. It's called Dogwood, and it's a short film that she had done during the pandemic, actually, which is like super interesting because it was really hard to do. We were fully masked in the whole production, and the production team at the time, because this was in 2021 when we did the film, and it's a 15-minute film. And as I mentioned, I'll show it next time, but the amount of work that went into it was pretty massive. Like our campus, like through me, helped provide, like I rented a shuttle. So I was the shuttle captain for the event. And then also my mom and I did like the catering. So we cooked for the, and we had a very skeletal crew where we had like, Maya had done the script writing and the direction of the film, and then her partner, her boyfriend, Cole, is a cinematographer, and so he did the what they call DP, director of photography, and it was a real family effort, right? But it's really been cool. It's a cool experience to learn about that, and in that particular film, part of what we're looking at is the idea of you may have heard of missing and murdered Indigenous women or persons here in Montana. So looking at how do we prevent violence in ways, and especially when you look at, so I mentioned some of the statistics before, there's a lot of underreporting that happens within, any community, but here in Montana, and part of that is tied to, we have, like for the Blackfeet in particular, we have like 1.5 million acres or something insane like that, and there's like 20 some police officers who serve the community. And so we see a lot of cases that go either unreported or there aren't follow-up. And so one of the problems is then you see a lot more crime within the community and violence exposure to the community and to children and to communities. So so anyway, the film is an artistic take on that. And so we think about the complexity of that particular issue as far as MMIW, as it's not it's not completely an insider outsider situation. You know, a lot of times, as I mentioned, lateral violence is part of the key question there. So this is kind of looking at, you know, I just wanted to express my gratitude to Emily and to the Montana Public Health Training Center, because I think these types of opportunities really help people to think about ourselves as a profession, as a public health profession, and we think about reducing compassion fatigue. And some of these opportunities to engage in these trainings are really helpful, because we can start to think about you know, ways to combat that. Because honestly, speaking as a faculty member here, a lot of our community of faculty here are dealing with compassion fatigue in some degree to the other. And as public health professionals, you or people you may know may also be dealing with this. And what that is when we have chronic exposure to stress, like we've had during the pandemic and following the pandemic. We've had a lot of folks who are dealing with mental health issues, students, as well as people that we serve. So how do we communicate with students, colleagues, and families in ways that help support emotional health? And so really, when you're thinking about, this comes from the psychology literature, we have a kind of a curvilinear relationship between our performance and our stress level, right? And so if you have actually too little stress, you know, which, you know, doesn't usually happen. We do, but it can happen in cases where people are really depressed clinically, where they have, you know, too little activation, that sort of thing. But over time, if you have increasing levels of stress, you can start to experience fatigue and exhaustion, and then at the extreme end, anxiety, panic, anger, and, you know, having, like, you know, kind of a breakdown in your system of coping, right? And so when we think of that, we think about ways to intervene with that. So compassion fatigue is really when we have that empty tank that we're running with, and we're trying to fill our tank in different ways. Sometimes the perfect way of refilling our tank is to go to creativity and to, like, look at investing in creative ways to look at public health problems. Because, you know, I'll be honest, it's really difficult working on suicide prevention or substance abuse, or many of the areas that you're working within can very commonly lead to what we call secondary trauma responses in providers, as well as, you know, some of this compassion fatigue as a common outcome. So Viktor Frankl is one of my favorite authors. He was an author who wrote about his experience surviving the Holocaust as a Jewish psychiatrist. And so he survived and developed a type of therapy that was called logotherapy. And logotherapy is one that's based on meaning. And so he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's basically looking at this idea of how we can survive, you know, difficult experiences. And so for many people who are in most need in public health, they are looking for some of that. Like, how do I make meaning following this experience? How do I make meaning in ways that are adaptive for me and things? So this is some of what we think about when we think about looking at creative media use. And so this is a thing I wanted to share just in terms of, I think it's helpful for a lot of folks, but when we think about, as a psychologist, there's ways that we can help improve our health in terms of the messaging. And this is really important as we think about script development for public health videos. We think about helping people that we're working with to use a resiliency-based narrative. So that's looking at not using all or nothing thinking. This always happens, never happens. These are things that we think about with cognitive behavioral therapies. So this is really very just basic kind of ways of thinking about this, but these are things that honestly we are all guilty of in some way or the other. You know, one of the things we know from the, you know, science as well as practice of things like depression and anxiety is people who tend to think in ways that are kind of fall within these different categories if it's like depression, we tend to more ruminate about the past. If it's anxiety, we tend to worry about the future. And a lot of the goal within psychotherapy and public health and harm reduction approaches is mindfulness, and that's being more present in the moment and reframing things like this, like when we think about all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, dismissing positive information, jumping to conclusion, those sorts of things. And so these are things, you know, and we're not in a therapy space right now, but as we're thinking about developing interventions or prevention kind of strategies, important to think about, because many of the people who we may interact with who have had exposure to more trauma than others are more likely to engage in these sorts of automatic thinking. And that can be, you know, problematic, and why we think about you know, narrative approaches. So this in one nutshell frame is cognitive behavioral therapy. So a lot of what we do is we think about the way that our thoughts, our automatic thoughts, impact our emotions and how that interacts with our actions or behaviors. So those three things are really powerfully linked. And as we think about ways that we can intervene, we can think about reframing, resisting when we have like automatic thoughts that may be troubling to us in different ways. Rest, there's a new book that's called Rest is the New Resistance. And as we think about resting our brains and our bodies and finding ways to like reconnect with nature and recreating things in different ways. So these are some of the things that, you know, are really generative. And a lot of the philosophy of public health is narrative approaches to healing, and that's what we're talking about today. So these are just some images that kind of like give some examples of that. For different folks, it could be art, creating art. These are two ledger artists, Jesse DeRozier, who is at Pekani Boy Media. He does some really wonderful ledger art. John Peppian, he has a documentary coming out soon that's in partnership with Ken Burns, and they have looking at the return of the buffalo to some of our tribal communities, and that'll be premiering here in Missoula, I think June 8th, and then it'll be on PBS in the fall in October. Here in Missoula, we have All Nations Health Center, and they do really wonderful work outreaching. And during the pandemic, you could actually, they had a series called Soup and Stories, where you would, they would actually give you, you know, ingredients to make a soup, and then over Zoom you would make a soup together, and then at the very end of that session, an elder would come in and provide stories from the different tribes in Montana, and it was a really powerful way for folks to interact, and in times where we couldn't physically be in contact with each other, but we could share space. So it wasn't this, you know, it was a way that we could kind of cope, you know, in what we call parallel play in psychology. And, you know, for many of us, we've found ways to like have adaptive coping be part of our daily lives. And so, you know, this is something when we think about compassion fatigue is acceptance. And a lot of what we think about in public health is also, you know, some of the stats that I reviewed earlier are pretty daunting, you know, and we can't have an immediate fix for things like racism, right? It takes a while to like find ways to like deconstruct that. So some of the work that we do is finding ways to talk and get support. So we might not be able to change a situation, but helping our communities be able to talk with each other, practicing positive self-talk when you're stressed. And so that's part of what we can do with our you know, storytelling is also learning from our own mistakes, looking at teachable moments, things that, you know, we want to change over time. And so some of this is really helpful as we think about narrative. I wanted to share with you, and I know we're almost out of time and I'm going to leave some time for questions, but so this is something that we did. We were able to do some clinical trial work with narrative exposure therapy. And narrative exposure therapy is a form of therapy that is empirically based. It is based on clinical trial work that's been done internationally as well as here. It's been done with Native communities as well. And it is a really cool way of using oral tradition and in actual trauma therapy. The central, you don't all have to become therapists, don't worry. There won't be any test about any of this, but basically with trauma therapy, one of the things that we do is habituation. So if you're remember back to biology classes and things like that, you know, one of the things that happens when any of us have experienced trauma is we have fight, flight, fright, or sorry, fight, flight, freeze, right? So we have those three responses that often happen. And one of the things that happens when people have had a diagnosis of PTSD is that they're more easily reminded of things that can kind of trigger the fight or flight response. And so part of the therapy is what we call exposure and response prevention. Now that doesn't mean that we're you know, literally preventing responses for people, but we're helping them use relaxation techniques. We're helping them use acceptance. There's a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. We're using kind of these different kind of ways of helping them in the moment reduce the trauma kind of response. So with narrative exposure therapy, it's a very vocal, short-term therapy that can be used by people who don't necessarily need to have like a PhD in clinical psychology. They can have, you know, just a background in this approach. And a lot of it is trauma survivors telling their life stories and creating a lifeline, incorporating different symbols. And so you'll see a little example in the next slide. But it includes both positive events as well as like more difficult or challenging or even traumatic events. And so then subsequent sessions, so you first have your session where you lay your lifeline, and then the subsequent sessions are about the two blue arrows here, where you're processing the emotional side of the experience with the factual side of the experience. And so you might be wondering how this pertains to digital storytelling, but a lot of what we see is that, you know, people who are engaged in storytelling in one way or the other are kind of working through some of these aspects and elements. And so it can be really adaptive and healing. And we know from the scientific literature that it works. It helps to reduce trauma symptoms of different kinds. So as I mentioned, this first session with narrative exposure therapy, sorry, I'm having to move my little widget around here, is laying the lifeline. And that is where you have a literal rope, like you see here in the photo, that you lay down with a person who then tells their life story. And then you take like something like a Post-it note, and then with the person you help to write down the very basic, what we call cold aspects, which is just the who, the what, the where, what the label is for the event. So the first flower there could represent their birth, you know, and so you would write little notes about, okay, your birth, when it happened, who was there, that sort of thing. And then you move through there's some other positive events, and then the stones represent traumatic or challenging events. And so as you kind of go through the lifeline, the goal is to really connect the hot and the cold memories of that trauma and that traumatic experience. And so you're weaving two parts of that memory together, and you're bringing together the cognitive piece of the thing, of the event, and with the emotional, and then the body, then and now. And so a lot of times that's what we see when we see PTSD symptoms, that we see that there's kind of a disconnect between those things, where there may be an amnesia for the event itself. There may be what we call avoidant symptoms, which can be things like including also just feeling numb, emotionally numb, those sorts of things. So those things are all really interwoven in ways that we can treat clinically, which is, you know, really hopeful. But that's the kind of goal, is we're weaving together identity. And that's a lot of what we're doing in digital storytelling, is we're helping people to identify who they are, like the Roger video that we looked at, who they are in balanced ways, like acknowledging challenging parts of the self or of our story, with really, positive, adaptive ways that we have coped or we hope to cope, or that, and then the goal is to reduce symptoms, right? And then we also want to like reduce inequity, and we reduce discriminatory practices for many American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous communities. So social justice is part of public health, and we're also reducing stigma by looking at how we think about acknowledging the courage it takes to kind of have this different narrative, and then of course improving access to services. And so part of narrative exposure therapy is, which is really cool, is they have done testimonial work where they document this and share it with people who are making policy and funding decisions, and able to like do that through story. Sometimes they do that through video, sometimes through podcast, spoken word, or through written testimonials and things of that nature. So I mentioned dogwood. We're going to see that example next time, but these are some photos from the production of that. And so as we think about digital storytelling, we think about how do we engage marginalized communities as they advocate for justice and health equity. And so these are just some photos to kind of get your kind of imagination stirring and thinking about what kind of stories you would like to tell. As we think about next time, we'll talk about the tools that you can use for creating videos and creating podcasts and things. And so we'll talk more about that. And a lot of it is for the work we do in public health is about resiliency. I have this term resiliency I used in my dissertation many years ago. I think, yeah, I mean, God, we're coming up on 30 years ago. Is that right? I can't believe that. Well, no, 20. So, but as we think about trauma-informed science, ethics, and creative efforts, we're looking to heal communities, really, and we're looking to heal individuals who are facing legacies of systematic marginalization. And so as we diversify science and academia and public health, those are stories and narratives that are very important to capture and to share. And that's part of what the philosophy is with digital storytelling. So I wanted to share the story of a mentor to me who is, his name is Mike Brustead, and he just graduated last year from the University of Lethbridge. And he defended his entire dissertation in the Blackfeet language. He had it translated into English as well, but he had collected this and analyzed this from a cultural perspective and lens of an elder. He's 72, I think, years old. And so, I think that that's a really cool example. He last fall actually flew in a helicopter to the top of one of the mountains in Waterton, their sort of national park up in Canada, and was able to rename that mountain its original Blackfeet name and conduct a pipe ceremony in that same place. And it's been really, really helpful as we think about how we invest in place and growing into health that can happen within public health approaches. So that's a really cool dimension that we think about. And this is a photo just from like a couple weeks ago up on our reservation. Our flowers are finally back after a difficult winter. And then this is just a photo from our public health graduation last year. And there's multiple Native folks who graduate each year from our different programs here, including, I mentioned, Deshane Barnett, who taught for us this year a class on ceremony and culture and healing within Native American studies, which is really, really cool. So his dissertation was looking at traditional healing and traditional medicine, and to help people recover from substance abuse. And so that's a really very cool, hopeful. Nick Coombs had done some work on one of my projects. What I mentioned, the study that we did with Blackfeet. Leo Bird he's working on completing his terminal degree, and he is his father is the one who actually did the star stories for us here in the planetarium, who's one of the science teachers on the Blackfeet Reservation. And then Elizabeth Williams, she works for All Nations and finished her master's and is completing her doctoral degree as well. So we have a lot of really wonderful graduates from our program, and I talk about Ikakima because that's the idea of public health, resiliency, and strength-based approach. So, and then I wanted to just mention, this is a photo of my great-grandmother who is holding a crow. I don't know if you can, like, or a raven actually. So it's her pet raven that she's holding in that photo. So talk about stories, right? So as we think about other fields of literature, her work has been in Indigenous science. And so, so there's a whole chapter on her experiences as a Blackfeet woman and as a healer, and she was a plant medicine healer for our tribal community, and there's a whole ethnography, and we can learn so much from those things as we think about behavior and behavior change. So that's part of what I wanted to end today with, is just thinking about our pathway forward and our, you know, the power of storytelling. So next time we're going to talk more about the tools. I might be in correspondence to look at like a little quiz to see if you, you know, are listening, but also just it's a fun quiz to kind of look at Kahoot as just, I'm not promoting any particular company, but ways to engage people in like different ways of knowledge building. So it'll be on the lookout for that link. It'll be fun to kind of just, you know, look at different ways of promoting public health knowledge and things. So yeah. But that's all I have for you today. I really appreciate everybody hanging in there. And I promise next time will be a little more interactive. What I would like to ask too is just, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me in the interim. Emily has my email address. It's just annie.belcourt@umontana.edu. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Annie. And yes, I will make sure to send out your contact info and a PDF of the slides if that's cool with Annie. Looks good. And then we'll get this recording prepared and send out a link to that as well for anyone who had to step out or wants to review before next week. You'll get a reminder from me again next week, so you don't forget to tune in at 10 a.m. next Wednesday. And I look forward to seeing you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.